Imagine standing in front of a polished piece of metal, the closest thing you'll ever see to a mirror. You peer into it, eyes wide, and wonder, do I look beautiful today? But this isn't your reflection in a modern vanity. It's a cold, warped surface, cloudy in the corners, barely showing more than the rough outline of your face. The year is 1342, and you are a young woman in a small English village. You've just plucked the last of your eyebrows, scraped ash on your teeth to make them look darker, and rubbed pig fat into your cheeks to give your skin that pale, doughy finish that noble ladies are known for. You don't feel beautiful, you feel tired. But in this world, your world beauty is not about looking healthy, it's about looking holy. And the holiest things are quiet, pale, thin, and otherworldly. The beauty standards of the medieval world were not born in the mirror. They were born in scripture, in poetry, in whispered gossip beneath wooden balconies. They were shaped by saints, by queens, by painters who had never seen the inside of a woman's soul, but could paint her virtue into a perfect oval face, framed with hair the color of wheat at harvest, hair that was rarely seen, because to let your hair show in public was often seen as a kind of sinity, lest you were married, or very young, or very brazen. There were rules. There were always rules. The church preached modesty, and women followed, hiding their hair beneath veils, wimples, and linen coifs that scratched at the scalp and smelled faintly of herbs. It wasn't about comfort. It was about virtue. Beauty was moral. Modesty was beautiful. And a woman who revealed too much her ankles, her throat, her shoulders might be mistaken for a prostitute, or worse, a temptress. But behind closed doors, beauty thrived in strange ways. Some women applied crushed iris roots to their skin, believing it would make them glow like the Virgin Mary in the tapestries. Others bled themselves gently, pale skin seen as a sign of good breeding, and a weak constitution, perfect for marrying into wealth. And when bloodletting wasn't enough, there were always powders, lead-based powders, poisonous powders. Powders that, over time, would make the skin crack and scar. But they were popular, because pale skin was not just beautiful. It meant you didn't labor in the sun. It meant you were rich enough to stay inside, to be pampered, to sip almond milk and chew on candied violets. Violets, yes. They were eaten for breath along with mint and angelica root, and sometimes fennel seeds, because breath was part of beauty too, and teeth. Oddly enough, blackened teeth were not always frowned upon. In some areas, stained teeth from herbs or smoke were seen as noble. In others, white teeth were praised, but hidden too much smiling could be seen as improper, especially for a woman of status. To be beautiful in the medieval world meant to be quiet, controlled, decorated, but not too decorated. Thin, but not from hunger. Pale, but not sickly. Youthful, but not childish. Fertile, but not lustful. Attractive, but not inviting. A paradox of perfection. And that paradox was written in every poem, every song, every prayer offered in candlelit chapels. The Lady of the Lake had skin like snow and eyes like polished jet. The Virgin Mary was always depicted with the same small mouth, high forehead, and gently sloping shoulders. Real women plucked their hairlines to imitate that forehead. Yes, plucked them. Sometimes painfully. Sometimes with the aid of vinegar-soaked cloths or tweezers made from sharpened bones. Because a high forehead meant intelligence, virtue, humility. A wide forehead was a canvas of grace, a low hairline. Too bold, too earthy, too common. So women plucked. Even noble women, especially noble women. They sat for hours as servants helped them remove hair from brows, from the sides of the face, from under the chin. And all the while they sat still, dreaming perhaps of troubadours who sang of women with lilies for hands and lips, like ripe apples left in the snow. Men had standards too, but theirs were rooted more in strength, symmetry, and poise. A nobleman's face was expected to be calm, unmarked by labor. His shoulders broad, his legs long fit for armor. His hair neat, often shoulder length, and sometimes oiled or perfumed. Beards went in and out of fashion, but the clean face, when worn by a knight, signified youth and divine favor. But unlike women, men could show their beauty in battle, in public games and tournaments. Their beauty was often a blend of appearance and action. A woman's beauty, meanwhile, was stillness. and sometimes silence. Let us slip back into those dimly lit chambers, where the candlelight dances on stone walls and secrets are whispered between women brushing each other. As hair before sleep, beauty in the medieval world was not only elusive, it was politicized, especially for noble women, whose looks were often their most valuable currency in marriage negotiations. Alliances were forged not just by land and title, but by a girl's face. Her appearance could raise or lower her dowry, spark conflict between kingdoms, or seal peace after years of war. In one infamous example, Eleanor of Provence was described in chronicles not just as beautiful, but as radiant, with eyes like polished onyx and a voice as soft as smoke. It was shaped by tutors, artists, and religious advisors. It was practiced in front of polished copper, and when that wasn't enough, it was painted. Her appearance was so central to her political value that chroniclers wrote more about her skin tone than her governance. Her husband, Henry III of England, praised her for her noble face, a phrase that carried immense weight suggesting divine favor and inner grace, especially among the upper classes. But what was a noble face? It wasn't just physical. Women still painted, carefully in secret, or under the guise of treatments or medicinal creams. It was a cultivated thing, a carefully maintained image of piety, modesty, and restrained allure. A woman who painted her face, they warned, might be aligned with demonic forces. She might be tempting men into lust. She might be disguising her sins beneath a mask of false holiness. Yes, painted. The same text that denounced female vanity also described women in poetic, sensual detail. Cosmetics in medieval Europe were controversial, but widely used. They used white lead to pale the skin, vermilion to redden the lips and cheeks, charcoal or soot to darken the eyes. They mixed honey with herbs to soften the skin, and crushed pearls for a glow. Many of these substances were toxic, but that wasn't always known. Or if it was accepted. Because beauty demanded sacrifice. Sometimes that sacrifice was health. Sometimes dignity. The church often condemned cosmetics as tools of vanity or worse, of deception. Hair, if long and thick, was a mark of vitality. And even poor women might save scraps of animal fat or ashes to rub into their skin or hair, mimicking the beauty rituals of their social betters with what little they had. And yet, quietly, she applied it with a swan feather. When a priest caught her and accused her of vanity, she replied, "Even the Lord gave flowers color. There was always a way." Just as there was always contradiction, others oiled their hair and used flower water to perfume themselves, because the same church that condemned cosmetics also celebrated the beauty of the Virgin Mary. It was confusing, frustrating, and for many women, impossible to navigate. They were told to be pure, but alluring, to be modest, but admired. Poets described ideal male beauty as slim and well-formed, with long limbs and a gaze that could calm a hawk. Courtiers took this to heart, and some even wore padding beneath their tunics to appear broader in the chest or shoulders. To be pale but healthy, to be beautiful but never vain. So they walked a razor-thin line, balancing on centuries of expectation. And not just noble women. Peasant women, too, faced beauty standards, though theirs were shaped more by practicality and local culture than by courtly ideals. In many villages, rosy cheeks were prized not from rouge, but from honest labor in the fields. A plump figure could signal good health and fertility. There is a record from 1327 of a bakeress daughter in France who made her own rouge from crushed strawberries and egg yolk. She was fined, but not flogged. The tension between beauty and sin always hung in the air. And not just for women. Men, too, had their burdens. Knights were expected to maintain a graceful strength, a body hardened by war, but unmarred by it. There are records of young squires using chalk dust to lighten their skin, mimicking the aristocratic pallor of their lords. Some took it further, plucking stray hairs, wearing ornate brooches, even dyeing their beards. They were mocked, sometimes called fops, accused of womanly vanity. But they persisted. Because even in an age of iron and plague and prayer, beauty still mattered. Perhaps, especially then. When life was short, brutal, and uncertain, beauty offered a glimpse of the divine, a spark of order in a chaotic world. Let's move quietly now, cross muddy roads and winding stone corridors. From the soft-spoken convents of England to the perfumed palaces of Moorish Spain, because medieval beauty was never one thing. It changed, shifted, adapted with geography, religion, and custom. But further south, in the flourishing courts of Al-Andalus, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian cultures mixed in uneasy harmony, beauty was far more openly celebrated. In the Christian West, beauty was often bound to restraint. There, in tiled gardens filled with jasmine and night-blooming flowers, women read poetry aloud and painted their eyes with kola tradition inherited from the ancient world. But even in poorer homes, women dried lavender in thyme, rubbing them on the body or placing them in cloth sachets near their chests. A beautiful person did not just look pleasing, they smelled like paradise. They stained their fingertips with henna, scented their hair with saffron oil, and used rose water to cleanse their faces. Skin was not merely to be hidden, it was to be adorned, celebrated, praised in verse, and admired beneath silk veils and gold-threaded scarves. It was believed that scent was a form of elegance, even seduction. Perfumed gloves, scented pages, oils infused with crushed herbs and flowers, these were the luxuries of the elite. Because beauty, in many places, was a full-body experience. A man who swaggered or walked with too much pride was seen as foolish, but one who moved like a night-measured, slow, composed was admired. It was believed that one's soul revealed itself in posture, not just the face, to never fidget, to never slouch, to always seem a little like they were carved from ivory, not just the hair. The women marked by pox scars, crooked teeth, missing fingers, rough hands, or limp, a way of holding herself, of smiling just slightly, of stepping softly on stone floors. She was considered unbeautiful by the court chroniclers, but deeply beloved by her husband, who commissioned poems in her honor. But movement, gesture, voice. In Italy, a graceful woman was said to have gracia naturale, natural elegance that couldn't be taught. Even laughter mattered. Loud, unrestrained laughter was seen as coarse, vulgar. She was described as bent and scarred from a fire, but always smelling of clove and lilac. A beautiful woman's laugh was meant to be quiet, controlled, almost hidden. Men, too, were judged by how they moved. Posture, in fact, was often trained in childhood, especially for noble girls. A scar on the cheek could be seen as a sign of courage. A lost finger might become a story of sacrifice. They were taught to walk with books on their heads, to keep the chin down but the neck long, to keep the hands folded or gently raised. But what of those who didn't fit the ideal? Just whether true or myth, the story persisted, passed down in convents as a warning. Even holiness could not protect you from the consequences of beauty. The too dark, the too fat. Fertility was linked directly to beauty, and once that was gone, many women faded into cultural silence. They existed in abundance, of course, just like now. And yet they often found ways to bend beauty standards or ignore them. Take Margarita of Navarre, a 13th-century noblewoman described by her contemporaries as short, square of face, and dark as shadow. And in some extreme cases, a nun's beauty was considered a divine sign, something to be managed, hidden, even feared. Matrons who advised kings, even grandmothers occasionally, who were described with tenderness. Her voice is a bell, and in her eyes I see the end of all my wandering. He wrote, "The moon has more shape, but none of her fire." In the town of Ghent, there's a merchant's record of a widowed woman in 1413 who ran a stall selling painted hair ribbons and rose paste. Beauty wasn't always what the poet said it was. It could be found in the unexpected, the unrefined, the lived in. And in some places, even the wounded were romanticized. Crusader ballads sometimes praised scars, not the grotesque kind, but those left neatly, heroically. But there was danger, too. For women who didn't conform, ridicule could be brutal. Pamphlets circulated with caricatures illustrated women with exaggerated noses, sagging skin, or coarse manners. These were warnings. Don't be like her, don't fall from grace. Even nuns weren't safe from judgment. Though their beauty was meant to be irrelevant, some convent records make quiet mention of Sister So-and-so, with skin like alabaster, or sister with voice of great sweetness. One mystic in 12th century Germany claimed she had to disfigure her own face to avoid unwanted attention. And then, of course, there was the matter of age. Youth was prized, nearly worshipped. Girls were married young, often as teens, but not always. There are letters, court records, even love poems addressed to older women, widows who managed estates. One French poem from the early 1400s reads, "Her hands are thin as parchment, because beauty didn't end at 30 or 40 or even 60. Not for everyone." There were always those who saw differently. Always those who chose love over ideal. Always those who dared to see past the powdered face, the painted mouth, the pale skin, the plucked brow, and maybe meant that there is something deeply human. Let's go even deeper into the quiet discomforts, the whispered rituals, and the contradictions that made medieval beauty so compelling, so strange, and so achingly human. Because beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't static. It responded constantly to tragedy, faith, and even pestilence. When plague swept through Europe, it left behind more than devastation. It changed how people saw the body. Suddenly, beauty was more fragile than ever life itself, more fleeting. Perfect complexion of a maiden could vanish overnight. The smooth skin of a nobleman could blacken in days. Too much beauty could distract from prayer. It could lead to sin. It could tempt not only men, but the devil himself. One tale speaks of a young noblewoman in Florence whose beauty caused a knight to kill his rival. In penance, she entered a convent. There, her hair fell out mysteriously, and her skin grew pale and thin. The nuns called it divine justice, but modern historians suspect lead poisoning. And so, the aesthetics of beauty began to evolve, not in celebration of health, but in defiance of death. The skeletal imagery we now associate with memento mori, reminders of mortality, became common in poetry, art, and even fashion. In some circles, women wore pendants shaped like skulls or coffins, carved from bone or ivory. Women dyed their hair with saffron, walnut husks, or even lye to lighten it to the coveted gold blonde hair they believed was angelic. Others wore wigs or added false hair made from silk or goat fiber, the same gold seen in the halos of saints. For women, long, thick hair was a sign of fertility and sensuality, so much so that it was often hidden, not because it was shameful, but because it was powerful. Women would sit on rooftops with bowls of lemon juice and sunlight, brushing and combing for hours in pursuit of a golden hue that could rival the Madonna's, not to revel in darkness, but to prove piety. To say, "I am not attached to this face. I know it will pass." These were not practical. They were not comfortable. But they announced wealth, leisure, beauty. Beards went in and out of fashion depending on the decade and region. In some periods, a smooth chin meant sophistication. In others, it meant you were a boy. Brides on their wedding day might wear their hair in long, flowing waves, a sign of purity and readiness. But once married, most women covered their hair with veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses. It wasn't just fashion. Public bathhouses existed in many cities, and nobles often had their own wooden tubs filled with scented water infused with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or thyme. It was theology. St. Paul had written, after all, that a woman's hair was her glory and must be covered in worship. This created a strange paradox. While beauty was still admired, it was also seen as a potential curse. Wore pomanders filled with spices and dabbed their skin with rosewater or violet extract. Some sewed small pouches of dried herbs into their undergarments. Others rubbed their hands and necks with lemon peel or cinnamon oil before attending mass or market. There were stories passed from one generation to the next of women whose beauty doomed them, because beauty, in pursuit, could be deadly. Let's talk about hair now. Posture you maintained, the prayers you whispered before touching your own skin. Hair in the medieval world was loaded with symbolism. It was a practice, a performance, a daily devotion. Now, the layers involved in creating medieval beauty, unmarried girls wore their hair down, often braided or loosely tied with ribbons, and worship was everywhere in medieval life. But while hair was sacred, it could also be manipulated in pursuit of beauty. Blondness became so sought after in certain regions that some women burned their scalps trying to bleach it. In Venice, blonde hair was practically a cultural obsession. But hair wasn't just about color. It was about shape, style, status. Some noble women styled their hair into towering constructions, held together by pins, laces, and wax. And for men, hair mattered too, though not always in the same way. A knight's long hair might be tied back during battle, but in court, loose curls signaled youth and virility. But whether bearded or bare, the ideal man was one whose appearance suggested control, strength without vanity, cleanliness without pride. And speaking of pride, let's talk about smell. Yes, smell. Because medieval standards of beauty weren't just about what you looked like. They were also about what you smelled like. Bathing was a complex affair in the Middle Ages. It was practiced far more than popular myths suggest, especially among the wealthy. A clean scent was a mark of refinement, a foul odor. It was associated with poverty, illness, or even moral decay. People burned fragrant woods, but it wasn't just for social nicety. The belief was that pleasant smells warded off disease. A beautiful person was one who carried their scent like armor protection against plague, envy, and sin. So imagine not just the face you showed, but the hair you hid, the smell you carried, the voice you used. Beauty wasn't an accident. And for all its contradictions and cruelties, there were also moments of strange liberation. In the medieval world, appearance was more than surface, was seen as a reflection of the soul. Crooked back might suggest sin. A twisted face might be the mark of demonic influence. Dwarfs who were gifted rings and silks by noble patrons. Giants who were invited to perform in royal halls. Their bodies may have defied the ideal, but they became part of the spectacle, the story, the power structure. They existed not outside of medieval beauty, but in a strange orbit around it. A mole, a birthmark, broken, even repulsive by earthly standards. Saint Margaret was said to have burst from the belly of a dragon covered in slime and smoke. Saint Mary of Egypt in her later years, their hair, their figures were often cast aside. Widows became invisible. Mothers faded into silence. Cronehood was rarely romanticized, unless the woman was a healer or a prophetess. Wandered the desert sunburned, he describes her as weathered as the hull of a ship, and says, "You are my harbor still." Hairless, the philosopher Boethius wrote that true beauty lies not in form, but in wisdom. And that idea rippled through centuries of theology and art, and shriveled with fasting. Even a freckle could invite suspicion, whispers, or worse accusations of witchcraft, or eyes that saw too clearly, reclaim the body in all its messy truth. To remind viewers that real life was not always graceful. And yet this fear existed side by side with something else. Fascination. There were hunchbacked jesters who became beloved at court, in the way someone walked, limping slightly, but with purpose. And then there were the saints. Many saints were described as disfigured, and yet they were beautiful. Not in the way of court ladies or alabaster statues, but in a spiritual way. Their suffering made them radiant. Their deformities became signs of holiness. She had once been a beauty praised in her youth, but by then her body was failing. Which begs the question, was ugliness sometimes its own kind of beauty? For wit? For warmth? They wrote songs about lost teeth and crooked fingers. They wept when those hands were gone. Yes, in the minds of many medieval thinkers. Ugliness could be divine punishment or divine reward, a way to purge vanity, a mirror of internal purity. But that didn't mean people were free from judgment, not by a long shot. Women who aged who lost their teeth, her power was dangerous. And even then, stories abound of midwives accused of sorcery simply for knowing too much, for looking too old, for having hands that trembled. A beautiful woman could be a prize. An old woman could be a threat. And yet love still happened. Deep love, physical love, passionate love that ignored wrinkles and scars and bent spines. There's a letter from a merchant in Bruges to his wife, written in 1381. Love, after all, sees differently than society. And there were many who loved outside the lines of accepted beauty. Artists, especially, pushed those boundaries. Though idealized images of women were common oval faces, long necks, and pale skin, the margins of illuminated manuscripts tell another story. There in the borders are caricatures. Women with enormous noses, men with sagging bellies, naked figures with mismatched eyes, grotesques. They are funny, strange, and deeply human. Some historians believe these images were a way for medieval artists to critique the perfection demanded by their patrons. Real life was lumpy, hairy, lopsided, loud, and sometimes lovely. Because amid all the rules and restrictions, people still found beauty in unexpected places. In a crooked smile, in a laugh that couldn't be suppressed. In the hush of candlelight, two lovers touching foreheads, not caring if they looked like the saints or the sinners. That was beauty too, and perhaps it was the truest kind. Because while the church taught that beauty faded and flesh corrupted, while poets chased impossible perfection, painters erased blemishes with every brushstroke, people still found ways to love the imperfect. They married for kindness. There is a story of a monk in the 12th century who nursed an old woman through her final illness. When she died, he wrote, "Her face was a map of sorrow, but when she smiled, I remembered the whole world." Beauty, then, was not just in the eye of the beholder. It was in memory, in meaning, in moments. And that might be the greatest lesson medieval beauty has to teach us. Not that people were foolish for their lead paint and plucked brows. Not that they were vain or repressed or tragic. But that they were trying, just like us, to be seen, to be valued, to be loved in the skin they were given, and in the image they tried to shape. And in the end, maybe they succeeded more than we give them credit for. Then let's press forward, past the gilded mirrors of courtly chambers, past the convent walls and battlefield tents, and into the quieter, stranger places where beauty and medicine came entangled, where myth crept into mirrors, and where sleep-deprived scribes wrote down the secrets of potions that promised to make someone lovable, or at least less blemished. According to humoral theory, the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these were balanced, your health and your appearance was sound. But if they were not, well then, beauty would betray you. Because in the medieval world, beauty was not just aesthetic, it was diagnostic. A glowing complexion meant not just attractiveness, but balance. Pale lips, too much phlegm, but perhaps more passionate. A man with pale skin and slender limbs was considered refined, but if he became too thin or too pale, whispers of illness or vice would follow. Dry skin, an excess of yellow bile, red blotchy cheeks, possibly a hot liver. Yes, they believed this. Dark circles under the eyes. Clearly too much melancholy, governed by black bile. So you see, beauty was never just about beauty. It was about health, morality, even personality. Women were advised to lighten their hair with sage or vinegar, not only for attractiveness, but to ease a troubled womb, or soften the humors of the brain. A woman with ruddy cheeks was not only thought healthier. This is why cosmetics and medicine often blurred. A face salve, made from almond milk, ground rice, and rose water, wasn't just a beauty treatment. It was also supposed to cool the blood, calm temperaments, and restore harmony to the body. A perfume wasn't just a scent, it was believed to protect against plague, to ward off evil spirits, to encourage fertility. Even something as simple as hair dye could be medicalized. And in some manuscripts, you'll find love potions and cosmetics written side by side. One 14th century Italian text recommends a mixture of honey, thyme, and the ashes of a dove's wing as a lip stain and as a charm to make a lover faithful. How much of this was believed? How much was desperation? Boys would sing, judges would be appointed, and the fairest maid of the parish might be crowned with a wreath of leaves. Hard to say. Men would oil, braid, and curl their facial hair into elaborate designs. But by the whiteness of their aprons, the neatness of their braids, and even the lilt of their laughter, a way of deciding who was worthy, who would be married first, who might catch the eye of a traveling merchant or a nobleman's son. The winner might be gifted a pouch of coin or a fine comb, but it shows how deeply beauty was woven into the very fabric of medieval identity. And it wasn't always about private use either. At fairs, during feast days, or in spring festivals, communities sometimes held beauty contests. Yes, medieval beauty pageants. He was sent to the monastery where, within a year, he was accused of seducing his confessor with just a glance. Cathedrals themselves were adorned with angelic faces, carved into marble, painted in gold, shining in stained glass. Faces that no real person could live up to. Was it true? Likely not. But that was the danger. When beauty didn't conform to usefulness, it became threat. Even tiny bells sewn into hems, so a woman would seem to float when she walked. Not in the polished form we know today, but in the spirit of comparison, of celebration, of public judgment. The slender female figure, the tall, broad-shouldered man. The belief that cleanliness equals worthiness. The suspicion that age and difference mean decline. In some German towns, unmarried girls would parade in their finest linen gowns and embroidered caps, bearing flowers or seasonal fruits. Sometimes, a local lord would sponsor a contest not for young women, but for beards. There are records of similar events in France, where milkmaids were judged not only by their faces. It sounds charming now, but it was also a mechanism of power. And always who would be whispered about behind closed doors. Because just as beauty could lift you, it could destroy you. Women who were too beautiful were accused of witchcraft. Men who were too pretty were accused of weakness. An old tale tells of a boy in a Scottish village, too fair and delicate for farming. And yet beauty was sought after anyway, copied, imitated, even faked. They made false eyebrows from mouse fur, false teeth from ivory or bone, pads to puff up cheeks or bosoms. And while the church thundered against vanity, the contradiction was everywhere. And it didn't vanish with time. If anything, it grew. Because the beauty standards of the Middle Ages planted seeds that still grow today. The pale skin ideal. We have not escaped these ideas. We have only reshaped them.